одного з найдосвідченіших експертів в питаннях дезінформації, в питаннях пропаганди. Пітер Померанцев, можна його представити як британського експерта, журналіста, продюсера і дослідника російської пропаганди. Пітер народився в сім'ї радянських дисидентів, він має зв'язок з Україною, з Києвом, але він довгий час працював і в Британії, і в Росії, і зараз по всьому світу працює. Зараз він є senior fellow університету Джона Хопкінса. Перед тим працював в Британії, є дописувачем багатьох видань London Review of Books, The Atlantic, Financial Times, New Yorker. І ми знаємо його також за його чудові книжки, які, на щастя, у нас перекладені і видані. В першу чергу я говорю про «Нічого, правдивого і усе можливе». І нещодавна книжка «Це не пропаганда. Подорож на війну проти реальності». Хотів ще підкреслити, що Пітер є не тільки журналістом і людиною з медіаспільноти, і це дало йому можливість зсередині побачити, як працює цей світ, і як працює темна сторона і світла сторона цієї індустрії і цього визначного інституту демократії так само. Але також він і є дослідником, зараз він працює саме в університеті. Але його книжки – це не книжки такого сухого дослідника. Дуже раджу, хто ще не читав їх, прочитати, тому що це велика насолода їх переглядати, за них заглиблюватися. Чудовий стиль, дуже жива розмова. Повірте, ви будете захопливі від першої до останньої сторінки. І крім стилю, це те, що нас безпосередньо всіх сьогодні турбує, тому що від війни інформаційної, як ми побачили, на жаль, починається війна гаряча, війна з конкретними жертвами, руйнуваннями, що ми сьогодні всі переживаємо. Технічно ще пару моментів. Ми переключимося за кілька секунд на англійську мову, і наша розмова буде англійською мовою. Крім того, ми матимемо приблизно годину часу до 19:30, плюс-мінус. І також ви матимете змогу, хто є сьогодні тут в Zoom, випускники Аспен семінарів, ви матимете змогу написати ваші запитання у віконечко Q&A, запитання і відповіді. І якщо раптом у мене тут пропаде зв'язок, я сподіваюся, що мої колеги Денис Полтавець, Аліна Шклярук, вони підхоплять цю розмову, щоб дати змогу нам всім безперебійно мати цю розмову. Ще раз вітаємо Пітера Померанцева. Peter, it's pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us and for finding some space in your tough schedule. So Peter, it's really pleasure to work with you, to have a conversations with you, and to read your books. Excellent, fascinating writing style, narration, storytelling, and so on. Happily, we have Ukrainian translations of your books, and you know that. And let's talk about key topics you are covering in your books and you are studying now. First of all, let's try to dig the concepts. You are trying to avoid the word, the noun propaganda in your books, so because of equivocation of this concept. This term is fraught and fractured in its interpretation. We also have such concepts like disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, post-truth age, and so on. But all these concepts are building the more familiar notion of propaganda. How you could define all this situation with these concepts and with this phenomenon of raising propaganda so much in modern times in our situation, and gradually we will move to Russia case, but let's define the concepts.
That's a great question. And when I teach my course about propaganda at university, that's what we start looking at, different definitions of propaganda. And look, even among academics, there's different definitions. There's some who say it's a neutral concept, any type of mass persuasion. So any type of me wanting to persuade a lot of people about something that I think is important and is good for me. But the morality is only in the cause. So you can be propagating a good cause or a bad cause or a neutral cause. I think everybody agrees it's always in the interest of the person doing it. So education is not propaganda. That's in the interests of the people studying. Medical information is not propaganda because that's in the interests of those receiving it. But in any point, whether it's political, advertising, any type of mass persuasion can be seen as propaganda. And again, that's not a judgment. You know, it depends what you're selling. Are you selling, you know, chocolate bars or some sort of political program? So that's the neutral case. Usually, it's used more negatively in the sense that it's taking away. It's somehow cheating people in some way. It's being somehow dishonest. It's saying it's one thing, but it's actually something else. I think that's how most people use it. Where there is an elemental dishonesty and manipulation there. A very classical academic one says that it plays to the emotions, that it subverts critical and rational thinking, and therefore subverts democratic thinking. I don't agree with that definition. I think that's a definition that comes from Aristotle, who I think is deeply flawed in his understanding of communication. I think the division into pathos and logos, emotion bad, rational good, is only a definition that could have come from people with deep issues with emotions, so academics. And the Habermasian idea of a public sphere is a very bad idea, I think. Sort of a pure crystalline rational sphere where only rational is good and all emotions are bad. That's a very academic definition, which I reject very strongly. So you see, we get into very, very complicated debates, which take us back to Aristotle. And, you know, you've started off talking about propaganda. You've ended up talking about, is Aristotle good for philosophy or bad for philosophy? I think for media and communications philosophy, he's a disaster. But that's probably not what we want to talk about. So I tend to avoid, I avoided the term in my last book. In the book I'm working on now, I actually use it all the time. But I think what we have to do as a society is try to understand what is a democratic public sphere. And instead of starting off with the negative, start off with the positive. What is this democratic public sphere that we want to have? What is this communication model that we want to have? Because look, propaganda in totalitarian dictatorships is not a bad word. Yeah, in the Soviet Union or in China, where it's called thought and tongue work, which I rather like, it's not seen as something bad. You're proud of it. I'm a propagandist. Great. What they're saying is that the democratic public sphere doesn't exist. What they're saying is that this idea that you could debate ideas independently, have your own thoughts, come to decisions, they're saying that doesn't exist. They're saying that's a myth. And of course, there's a very long tradition of criticizing the idea of a democratic public sphere in democracies, starting from Walter Lippmann in the 1920s and 30s, who says reality is too complicated for normal people. People cannot deal with it. We need a technocratic elite to rule over society, through to a lot of people in Silicon Valley today who say that people cannot deal with data. We need data elites who will organize society for us. So that's much more interesting as a conversation for me. What is the democratic public sphere that we're aiming for? And what is the democratic subject? And what is their relationship to information? And look, this is an old argument that goes round and round. In the 1920s and 30s, it's fought between Walter Lippmann, who says that democracy is impossible, we need elites to rule over society, and John Dewey, a philosopher at my university, Johns Hopkins, who says, no, 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 these technocratic elites will be a disaster as well. We need to have a space for discussion and debate in order to at least get rid of the bad ideas. But that's what it's really about. I mean, I'm not really interested in the technology of propaganda. I'm not really interested in disinformation campaigns. I think these are all technical, tactical questions, which, whatever. Somebody needs to research them, but I find them boring, frankly. I'm interested in these questions of, can democracy exist? What is a free person? When do you know that your opinion is your own? How do we encounter reality when it's so complicated? Those are the issues that I care about. And those are the questions that are at stake.
Yes, thanks, Peter, but we will react to some strategic and tactical level also. Sorry for this, but we are mid-war, and naturally we are interested in some tactics. But when we are talking about the post-truth, the word of year 2016, I guess, yeah, that we could define our age as a post-truth situation. Are you agree with this notion that we are in post-truth situation now, or it's just the repetition of time in Nietzsche sense, you know, a repetition of the same?
There's definitely things that go round and round, but to be post-truth means to be post-time. I think what I argue in my last book, that the concept of evidence in public discourse, in political discourse, the concept of truth, and the definitions of what evidence is, and the common definitions of what evidence is, are deeply tied to notions of time, and a rational idea of time, and an idea of the future. So the ideologies which valued an idea of time, democratic capitalism, communism, they're all obsessed with time and reaching some sort of utopia. They necessitated a rational language because they believed themselves to be rational systems, and you needed evidence to prove that you're getting there. And that existed very much in a system where time mattered. I mean, if we're talking about the public sphere, it was the age of the newspaper. Newspapers are very good at time. They gave us the news every day. They gave us the passing of time, the newspapers yellowing in the corner of your apartment. They gave us the main news every day. They gave us an idea of time and space. And that sort of disappeared, both technologically. On social media, there is no sense of time or space. Time stories swim up at you based around your narcissism, really, but definitely not around any idea of time. You know, you don't know if something's appeared yesterday or today or old or new. It coagulates around your instincts and desires. It doesn't coagulate under any common idea of time. So technologically, we're in a period where time doesn't matter, when facts matter a lot less, and ideologically as well. All these great ideologies that claim to announce a rational future have sort of collapsed, and we're swimming in a space where neither time nor evidence mattered the way they used to. So yeah, no, I think that's one of the symptoms of the time of our period. Has it happened before? There is definitely sort of something similar going on in the 1920s among bits of society. So it's interesting seeing what is cyclical, but some things are new as well.
A subtitle of your book is War Against Reality. And you also wrote that this abundance of information that we have now is concluded or have the consequences in feeling that everything that I thought solid unsteady and liquid. And in opposite to this position, that nothing is solid and everything is liquid and nothing is real, here in Ukraine we're maybe now in some privileged position because we know the reality as it is for us. We face it every day. For example, come to Irpin, to Bucha, other cities, and the damages are solid. The damages are not liquid, they are real. The graves are so real, and this is our reality. And now we are questioning how it is possible to deny all these facts and all this reality, and to create such an atmosphere of liquidity, of uncertainty. How could someone the reality and do completely the opposite picture? Let's talk about the origin of this war against reality.
Yeah, no, I think one of the many wars happening in Ukraine. I mean, the most obvious one is just Russia's imperial war against Ukraine, but there's a lot of other wars happening at the same time, and one of them is about this. What the Russians are saying is that they can redefine reality, that they can act with complete impunity. Truth and justice are very tied together. You know, what's the point of truth if there's no justice as well? And that they can reshape memory. I mean, as we speak now, there are bulldozers in Mariupol, bulldozing away the rubble of the buildings that the Russians destroyed, and there are corpses still in the buildings. They're not even taking the corpses out. So the reality of those lives is lost. The memory of those lives is lost. It's very hard to, well, we need to try to rebuild them. So they're wiping away reality every day. And that's what they're doing. They're saying, they're trying to prove that evidence doesn't matter. Even if you can do it, it won't lead to justice because Russia and China and Saudi Arabia will win. It's their world now. That's the argument they're trying to make. I think they'll lose, but that's the argument they're making. And that also nobody will remember. And here I'm very worried. What's going to happen with the reality of what's happened in Bucha and Mariupol in 20 years' time? Srebrenica is now under question, something I grew up with. The genocide in Bosnia is now placed under question. Did it really happen? So right now, where is that memory going to be stored? I mean, the internet is going to play a huge role. And I think we've really understood what is the relationship between memory and the online world. Will it become a ghettoized memory? Will there be a little corner of the internet where this memory is kept? If this was urban history, if this was a city, you'd build a museum in the middle of the city. How do you build a museum in the middle of the internet? Something tells me that Google will not want to take responsibility. The aim of the tech companies is to absolve themselves of responsibility as much as possible. The most they might do is try to elevate verification. But that's not about prominence, that's not about centrality. So what happens to memory in this completely balkanized world when the Holocaust has lost its primacy in memory? So I think one of the reasons Ukraine has inspired so many people around the world is because it has brought clarity. It has reminded us that there's good and evil. It has reminded us that you can be both a Democrat and a patriot at the same time, which had come under question. Ukraine has really focused minds and given clarity where there was none. And I think that's part of the reason it's inspired so many people. But if you look, that doesn't mean that this war is won. We're still in the middle of it. And there's many, many, many aspects to it. Essentially, what we have to do is try to work out what does truth, accountability, and memory mean today. You need all three. Truth without accountability becomes so hopeless that you don't want it anymore. Accountability without memory is also pointless. So we get justice tomorrow, but it has no lasting meaning. And we throw these words around. You know, you go to any conference now about Ukraine, it'll be about truth, accountability, and memory. But I don't think we've worked out what that means in the modern age.
So, and when we are talking about memory, we are referring to the concept of time that you mentioned before, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So this is all the continuity of this conceptual framework. Now the question regarding this war against reality and this liquidity, you know, of the facts that we are witnessing now. For us, the most part of Russian propaganda is completely bullshit. It's from the view of ordinary people, of our ordinary perception. Sure that there are some cases of more subtle and tricky narratives, but now we are witnessing, and usually it has nothing with common sense, with elementary logic and rules of thinking. They are just remember, let's recollect the last speeches of Russian leadership, that these are Ukrainians who did atrocities and torture against civilians in Donetsk. They are Ukrainians who did the genocide of Donetsk people. It's completely the opposite picture. How it can be? How it's a complete lie, and just to put the facts vice versa. How it could work at all?
Well, I mean, it depends on what. When we're talking about propaganda working, we're talking about several things. Talking about the message, which you're talking about here, but it's the target audience that really matters. What's the demand for the message? Propaganda is about demand more than about supply. You start with demand. The supply matches the demand. So those messages work if they fulfill a demand, and they may well fulfill a demand inside of Russia for people desperate to avoid reality at any cost. It might work in the global south and other places. So you have to go sort of like, they're clearly not aimed at Ukrainians, and they're not aimed at Western Europeans. So almost what we think is irrelevant. We'd have to just look at them. We'd have to be more specific. But certainly there's a huge desire within Russia to use any excuse to deny the reality of what's going on. And so almost anything you give them that will help that will be fine.
So that is why we see such a high percentage of support of Russia's war against Ukraine in Russian society. So you said that there is a demand in their society, right? But how this demand is originated, how they create the situation of such demand, because the people are not living now in isolated places, even under the authoritarian regimes in different countries. They have the opportunity to break this wall, to have some information, to receive some information flow, to have some alternative information. And this is okay for people who are concerned about their everyday lives. They are checking the information about goods, about services, about providers. Why they don't check the information about what is going on globally in the neighboring countries, in their rulers who announce the mobilization of their sons, of their relatives, of their husbands, who could be immediately killed in some hundred of kilometers.
Well, look, I mean, you have to break society and audiences down into many different segments. There isn't one type of audience. They all have different motivations. So I really struggle with this sort of blanket description. I mean, to the extent that I do studies of this space, of my first job in any type of society, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, America, where I do a lot of work, is to start breaking society down into different bits. Actually, Russians are quite high information users. That's not the point. I think this is a very common mistake, that high information users equals searching for the truth. People are actually quite high. I mean, not all segments, but a lot of segments in Russia are high information users. Actually, the ones who are low information users are often the liberals, because they just stick in one liberal ghetto. But a lot of people are actually quite high information users. They do experiment with different forms of media, but they either have a priority to then build up a world that they're comfortable in, using different sources. Now, I'll give you an example from America. Let's look at America. It's sometimes easier to look at a different country. There's a myth that the right wing don't look at alternative news, alternative sources online. They do. They'll just find anything that suits them. So they will go to a New York Times story that will tell them that there's problems with immigration. So it's simply not true that the way we conceive of echo chambers is wrong. It's not about medium, it's about narrative. So people will pull stuff from everywhere to help reinforce the narrative that they want to live in. And they'll like it. They'll say, oh, look, I found this story on the BBC that confirms my worldview. I'll reject the other one. So this is a bit of a delusion. Actually, Russians are quite high information users in general. So again, very generally, I'm talking about sort of like, people who have access to the internet. What they do largely push away from is the kind of Russian independent media, which does incredibly badly in Russia. But it's not true that they're sort of mono viewers. No, people actively do their best to avoid reality. So this idea that more information sources leads to closer integration of reality, it isn't that simple. Clearly, it makes it easier if you want that. But I think we really have to be a little bit doubtful about this ideal of a liberal subject, a liberal, that strives to look for reality. I mean, even for myself, I find myself, I go there, but I don't want to read about our defeats on the battlefield. I kind of push it down. I'd much rather see another video of a HIMARS destroying a Russian thing. There are websites out there which will tell you the real state of affairs, which is the real military state of affairs. And I get to them in the end, but I need a bottle of wine before I get there sometimes. It's hard, knowing that my friends are in the front. Reading about the details of what's going on and battle by battle is very hard. I'd much rather watch videos of HIMARS getting blown up HIMARS blowing up Russians every day. That's easy. So even someone like me, who's a high information user, who needs to know the reality of what's happening on the battlefield, even I feel myself emotionally not wanting to go there. I mean, who wants to read about whether their friends got killed this morning? So all of us fear reality a little bit. But in a situation like Russia, where there's this like huge appetite for centuries, it's not new, for centuries to avoid reality, for many, many reasons, then I don't think you have to do very much to stimulate the demand. The demand is already there. They then stimulate the demand, you're quite right, by sowing more chaos, by causing chaos and the sense that the world is a chaotic place that you can't understand. There's all this crazy information and manipulation out there. They call all, they say all the, they describe the world as full of information war and you can't trust anyone and they see doubt. And the reaction to that doubt is to then live within a coherent worldview. So in a sense, the more information sources there are, the harder people find it to deal with reality, the more they will then take shelter in a coherent narrative, and they'll use any type of evidence to reinforce that. And you're right, they do stimulate that demand, but frankly, that demand is already so high in Russia. So they don't create the demand, they can then stimulate it. And I mean, that puts us in a very hard position as well, because usually counter-propaganda would focus on spreading doubt in the opposition. That's what it would have done in the Second World War. But what's the point of seeding doubt in Russia if doubt only makes people want more authoritarian leadership? So it puts us in a very hard position. They're very good at doing it in the West. They're constantly seeding doubt and confusion in the West in order to sort of depress people. Well, it's a real question. What do you do in a society where the leadership thrives on chaos? It's a very complicated question for what do you do to counter this.
And so people are tending to be closed in their information caves, not even bubble in caves. And here we have the threat of new tribalism, a new isolism. So how we could solve the global problems, so when people are they're wanting just to reinforce their own outlook and not to have any relations with other views, not willing to enter the open discussion and finding the solution. So is the global humankind so desperate?
Yeah, I don't know about global, but I live in America where there's a real sense of having reached a dead end, and there's a real sense that democratic discourse has run into a cul-de-sac. There's a real sense that different bits of society can't talk to each other anymore. There's a real sense that the democratic experiments might collapse into civil war, or at least into sort of deadlock when no decisions can be made. And Russia, no one takes Russia seriously, but China certainly makes a big case out of this. Look at America, look at their freedom. It's led them into chaos. In a world of big data, only centralized, top-down decision-making can work. I don't know if you saw the Chinese 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party and went and watched their celebrations. And there was a lot of sort of scenes out of Mao Zedong and these sort of, you know, scenes of the masses, always the masses, doing these great choreographed dances together on this huge stage with all the Politburo watching and applauding. I mean, it's a sort of slightly shiny version of the usual Soviet shit. And at the end, right at the end, they go through Chinese Communist Party history from Mao through to Xi Jinping. And right at the end, when they talk about the future, this huge five comes down from the skies and everyone sort of almost gets on their knees and prays to it. I mean, they don't, they like applaud it. But it's not the 5-year plan. It's 5G. 5G has replaced the 5-year plan. The fact that 5G is the future, the fact that the CCP can control all the data, means that they can make the ultimate decisions. They can design the best cities. They can find you the best girlfriend because they have all your data. They can find you the ideal job, the ideal career, the ideal house. Everything will be decided for you because humans are incapable of freedom of choice, is the ultimate argument. So we're kind of back where we started from in the start of the 20th century. Well, also, you have accusations that democracy, and certainly capitalist democracy, is a mess. It's hopeless. The future is only with totalitarian regimes. Now the same argument is being made again. Again, you have a lot of American business elites in love with it. That's the challenge we face. So in that sense, it's very, very cyclical. So solving the democratic discourse impasse is very important. It's solvable. The problem is not that it's not solvable. There's ways of constructing digital spaces where democratic debate becomes possible. There's ways of constructing media whose aim is to create the modern agora, the modern space for a debate. All that is technically doable. Academics and various types of, especially digital entrepreneurs, experiment with these things. They come up with great ideas. The problem is not the technology. The problem is the incentive. it's absolutely unclear how you can make money out of this, and you probably cannot. Now, in Europe, we might find a way out. We have a tradition of public broadcasting. Now we need a tradition of civic technology and civic online media. At least we have an intellectual starting point to get there. We've got to be clear, though, the classic public broadcasters failed. The BBC did not make the leap into digital the way it should have done. The BBC was meant to, in the 90s, design a BBC social media. Yeah. It was blocked by the government. They said it would get in the way of these wonderful new countries like Facebook. The countries, companies. Not Facebook itself, but like that. No. That was a disastrous decision, one of the many disastrous decisions of the Blair government. So we missed that boat. We're going to have to start anew. However, at least intellectually, we can grasp it. In America, where they've become wedded to a kind of a mystical notion of the marketplace of ideas, it's absolutely unclear what will be the incentive and the support structure for this creation of a new public sphere. And that's very worrying, because weirdly, the best experiments happen in America, the best inventions happen in America, and there's absolutely no support for it.
Peter, let's move. Sorry for this. You said that you are not very interested in some tactics and some particular instruments, but let's move to this.
They're
level.
interested in me, though, so I've had to learn about them.
When we are talking about the key narratives about Ukrainians from Russia's side, why they, among numerous possible options, they selected the term, blaming us as a term as Nazis. Why they select this term? Is it for internal demand that you mentioned, or is it for foreign audience, for foreign leadership that are after Second World War are very shocked from the simple fact of pronouncing this word? Why they are blaming us and naming us as Nazis? And this is the fundamental of the another ideological construction of Ukrainian description in Russia.
I don't think they have any ideological constructions. They have psychological constructions onto which they throw different words. So they used Nazis for a while. They've almost stopped using it because it didn't really work. So I think there is no ideological construction there. There's kind of a naked psychological one. I mean, this current Russian propaganda has revealed the kind of psychological skeleton upon which Soviet or Nazi propaganda built ideology. So the ideological construction is irrelevant. It changes every week. I think Putin's invaded for 3,000 different reasons. Every time he opens his mouth, it's a different reason. 1 minute it's Peter the Great, the next minute it's Nazis, then it's NATO, then it's something else and something else. I mean, it's this, the words have no meaning. The psychological construction remains the same. And that's very interesting. They've got agaliliye, the underlying psychology of all aggressive propaganda. So that's interesting. I suspect, I mean, firstly, it's flopped and they've kind of almost stopped using it. But I suppose it's more largely internal.
Internal, not external.
Well, I think if it's external a little bit. It didn't really work. I mean, maybe it works more internally. I mean, you know, the Second World War, the connection to the myth of the Second World War is very important as part of the internal propaganda. I mean, I don't think anybody outside of Russia sees this as a continuation of the Second World War, even Russia's backers. Smearing Ukrainians as Nazis, I mean, that was a very sustained campaign, which has its life. I mean, you know, there's plenty of people in America who have kind of like, you know, have a relationship with this idea. So maybe he's partly thinking about those niche audiences. But But again, that's more like neo-Nazis, which is very different to Nazis, far right, that sort of stuff. I don't know. I think largely, I think probably it's more about internal stuff and the connection to the Second World War.
Okay.
I don't think haven't they, I mean, there's been some research on this. They've almost stopped using denazification as a term.
When we are talking about the effectiveness of Russian narratives on Western elites and Western societies, for example, first of all, why European leadership still have some sentiments to Russian narratives, and they could think that, look, Putin says this and that, Ukrainians say this and that, and might be the truth, and the real picture is somewhere in the middle between. Why so? Or maybe I'm mistaken now, and we have the complete support now, and for example, after the speech of German president after his visit in Ukraine, this is the complete support of Western elites for Ukraine.
I mean, I think I don't know what you mean by the West in this context. I mean, if you mean the EU has many different dynamics. I think generally the support is pretty solid in terms of deciding who's right and wrong. The only ones who seem to prevaricate strongly are Hungary. Apart from that, I don't see, I think everyone disagrees that what Russia has done is horrific. I mean, Bulgaria, but that's irrelevant. Even Hungary is relevant, really. But so if you mean by the West, Germany, France, Britain, America, is that what you mean?
I mean that some, for example, in Italy, in Hungary, in some local elites, even in Germany, there's still some sentiments to Russian narratives.
Yeah, I don't see any sentiments to Russian narratives in the sense of whose fault is it. As in, like, everybody agrees that this is, whatever the background is, everybody agrees that this is an aggressive war. It's a war of aggression, and there are war crimes, and it's horrific. The main prevarication isn't about that. The main prevarication is about what do we do next, and that's where the debate is.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when we are talking about the societies and these arguments of Russia and threats about freezing without the Russian gas, increasing all the cost of living, and we now witnessing that the huge debate, for example, in Great Britain, in Europe, that really we have the high inflations, we have this threats of prices of energy and so on. Is it effective from a Russian side to engage such debates and even change some elites and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be very effective. Again, because it comes quite organically anyway. So there's a logic that says if Ukraine stops fighting, cost of living will go down. So that's that definitely that is very important, because it pitches self-interest against philanthropy. And self-interest can always win against philanthropy. If it's philanthropic to support Ukraine, people feel nice supporting Ukraine, but then at one point they go, but like, this is too expensive for me. I've given too much money for charity this week. So yeah, that kind of binary is very, very useful to Russia, because they're doing everything badly. They kind of overplay their hand and have managed to even annoy the Germans. So they've been too aggressive in a way and too pushy, and there's been a bit of pushback, even in countries that didn't expect it. So, but yes, no, definitely, that's a very bad logic to get into. And we need to avoid it at all costs. We've got to frame this as what it is. You know, Russia is an abusive neighbor. And with abusive neighbors, what you do is cut off dependency from them. You know, you make sure that they cannot influence you or get to you in any way. And yes, that'll hurt for the first year, but then you're free. And that's the metaphor that we need. And I think generally, weirdly in Germany, all the opinion polls show people understand that much better than the elites. So Scholz is behind the people. The population's actually ahead of him, saying, no, we've got to cut Russia off. We've got to cut ourselves off. These are bad guys. You can't trust them. Actually, people usually get that because it's very visceral. It's a bully. What do you do with a bully? What do you do with an abusive partner? It's the elites who are still kind of playing games. But even in Germany, I think there is an acceptance that we're dealing with a very, very bad actor. And you cut off dependency to a bad actor.
The next question, maybe it's not for a couple of minutes, but let's try maybe just to touch the surface. Recently, we have the conversation here in Aspen alumni community about the role of culture in this war and in restoration or creating Ukrainian discourse. But let's talk a little bit about the role of Russian so-called great culture in this propagandistic discourse. However, we have such an argument that people who created Bolshoi theater or who created the Dostoevsky phenomenon can't be evil, so maybe this war crimes is not so criminal, and maybe Ukrainians and someone else are exaggerating the reality. What is your opinion on the role of Russian cultural phenomenon in this the whole propagandistic machine?
So I would well, look, there's two things here. Hold on. There's in the propagandistic machine, it's obvious. I mean, every time the Russians build a gulag, they put a statue of Pushkin next to it. I mean, like they were always, using their, these sort of artistic achievements to sort of like push their political objectives. So that's just cynical, and that's uninteresting. I have no problems with pulling down irrelevant Pushkin statues. They were put there by people who don't like art. They were put there by KGB agents. Fuck them. So, but that's uninteresting. That's just obvious. That's just what they do. In Magadan, I remember seeing a little Pushkin statue. I'm like, build a gulag, but a Pushkin statue. That's not very interesting. What's interesting is the deeper issue, and you use the word culture, and I would use the word culture here the way Raymond Williams, famous philology professor in Britain, used it, which is in the sense of sort of the overall common ideals of a society which are embedded in its language, in its education, in its artistic works. So not the reality of society, but how society imagines itself and projects itself. So I live in America, I grew up in England. We spent, certainly my generation, definitely the generation under, we spent all our times excavating, understanding, and getting beyond the political prejudices and power relations embedded in our literature. I studied literature. That was all we did. We spent all our time looking at the covert racism in Jane Austen and the imperialism in Jane Austen, who isn't overtly imperialist. They just all live in beautiful houses and we never know how they got the money. And so you start decoding where they got the money. So it can be a Marxist reading, a colonialist reading. It doesn't matter, many, many different types of reading. That's all we did. And maybe that went too far sometimes, in the sense that it gets you to a point where you go, well, the West is so evil, everywhere is so evil. And there's a relativism that can kick in, which is unhelpful. But overall, it's a sign of a healthy society that's constantly analyzing itself. I now live in America, where that's all that everybody ever does. The racism in Mark Twain, the sort of like the legacy of slavery in William Faulkner. I mean, that's all we do. Again, maybe we do it too much, but it's so good that we do it. Yeah. I mean, I only went to Russia for the first time when I was 24. And I went to film school there for a year. And I was interested in Soviet cinema, and I studied there for a year. And it was very interesting how little of that there was. The only people who did that were the people who studied with Alexei German. they were very interested in decoding some of that, at least Soviet language, the cult of the pioneer, that sort of thing. So there is some of that. But overall, and especially when we're talking about the 19th century, there just seemed very, very little of analysis of the colonial codes written into every piece of great Russian literature. I mean, if we would have done Lermontov or Tolstoy in England, we would have just done Tolstoy, Lermontov, colonial psychology, you know. I can even imagine the essays we'd have written, the like, we would have written endless deconstructions of what is a Kafkaski plennik. But the role of the whole as a mixture of misogynistic and colonial imagery in Russian culture, whatever. I can even imagine the bullshit we would have written, but it's good that we would have done that. There's just no attempt to excavate this, to understand how the imperialism runs through every great work of art, whether consciously because they're racist like Bulgakov, or unconsciously because they live in that world like Lermontov maybe. And there's this bizarre deification of writers in Russian culture. In the humanistic tradition of Russian culture, I could never get my head around this. This deification of Pushkin as a god. We don't do that in England. We spend all our time when we read Shakespeare decoding the evil in Shakespeare, the way he was anti-democratic, his misogyny, his anti-Semitism. Great writer, all these terrible things in his writing. So I found the deification of writers absolutely bizarre in Russia. And it's another form of authoritarianism. It's like, the great Tolstoy, what a god he is. It's a sign of a very sick society when you deify anyone like that, let alone your writers.
Okay, Peter, thanks a lot. I stop here with my questions because I have millions of them in my notebook. But let's switch to the questions of the audience, and maybe we will steal some more minutes from you. So the first question is, what do you think? And you could see it in Q&A window. What do you think about Elon Musk's rhetorics about Crimea and this war? Why he decided to post such pro-Russian position? Is there any politics behind this, and why? And maybe I will add, maybe it's some only business-driven posting of him, because here in Ukraine the posts of Elon Musk made some evenings and even some days, and it was a huge discussion about that.
Yeah, I think we're about to hear a lot about Elon Musk. I think I have this terrible feeling that he might be preparing to run for president. Or not terrible, it might break Trump, so it might be a good thing. Unlike Peter Thiel and some of these other Silicon Valley intellectuals who have a coherent authoritarian worldview, I don't think Musk has a worldview. And it's very, very, I think, pointed that his sabotaging of Starlink happened at the same time as he asked for more money. So he sounded like somebody who was using rhetoric to get more money. And if you look at his business, that's what he always does. He's a parasite. He doesn't create businesses. He parasites on them. And then he very skillfully uses various types of PR to sort of jack up his position. So given that he probably has no worldview, apart from his own vanity, and he's clearly talking to the Kremlin, and probably his vanity was very easy to manipulate for the Kremlin, it sounded a lot like business. Like, I want some money from the Pentagon. I'm going to start throwing my toys around, give me more money. Also, he's financially in trouble now because of Twitter. So, to the extent that he can be financially into trouble. So he doesn't seem to, just looking at his track record, there doesn't seem to be any ideology there apart from making money and enjoying trolling people. So I'm maybe less worried than other people because there is a strain in libertarian thinking which is pro-authoritarian. That sounds paradoxical, but this is a whole branch of Silicon Valley thinking, whole branch of libertarian thinking, which kind of broke with the main libertarians in sort of the 80s and 90s and 2000s, and who basically posit that the only right that matters is private property. The only one who can guarantee that is an authoritarian leader.
Thanks. And we have...
I don't think Musk thinks that much. I don't think he has thoughts. Thiel clearly does think that way, and it's in his writing. I don't think Musk thinks that deeply about anything.
Yeah, we have another question. It seems that the key goal of Russian propaganda is to force its recipients to believe that almost every political leader around the globe is corrupted and lies. At the same time, it seems that Russian people are not applying those lenses towards their political leadership. Why is it so?
Because if everybody's corrupt, if there's no idea of the good, then all that you need is tough leaders to lead you through this horrible world. Fox News does exactly the same thing. Right? Fox News says nonstop, the world is corrupt, everybody's corrupt, there's no truth, therefore you need Donald Trump to defend you in this fucked up world. So that's it. Yeah, we're corrupt, they're corrupt, everyone's corrupt, there's no goodness, there's just a Hobbesian universe, and obviously in a Hobbesian universe, the only person who can protect you is a big, tough man on a horse.
But if it is so, why some societies don't use these optics for their leadership? Why in Russia there is no such a demand for anti-corruption investigation and changing some elites and so on?
Yeah, why has Russia not been able to generate an idea of the good, is what you're basically asking. Yeah, it's very interesting. If you look at Russian literature since the 90s, even the best of it is very good at analyzing, deconstructing the bad. I was talking to Volodya Yermolenko, a brilliant Ukrainian philosopher, about this. He was like, Ukrainian literature, which went through the same traumas in the 1990s as Russia did, they'll write about it, but there'll be something romantic there. Even whether it's the kind of soft romanticism of Zhadan or the kind of Baroque romanticism and utopianism of Andriukhovich, which sees some sort of, positive through the chaos. Russian literature doesn't have that. It's all Mamliev and Sorokin and just like endlessly deconstructing its own feces. It's just sort of Schnur shouting hui, hui, hui endlessly. Yeah, they haven't been able to generate an idea of the good in art. They haven't been able to generate an idea of the good in politics. They haven't been able to generate an idea of the good in thinking and philosophy. So why? I mean, I'll let you answer that question.
Okay. Peter, some other 5 minutes, I'm begging you. We have another question. Usually when we talk about Russian propaganda, we mean Russian media. But in Russia, there is another very powerful propaganda tool, church. It was that particular church became one of the main creators of the idea of so-called Ruski Mir, Russian world, or how we could translate this notion. How would you rate the role of church in creating and maintaining propaganda narratives, and how they will or will not change with the fall of the current regime? So the role of church, and could we change the situation with the changing of regime or leadership in Russia?
God. I mean, the church has always been so.
Yes, it's about God.
I mean, the church. I'm not a huge expert on the Russian Orthodox Church. I think in the data, the polling that I've seen, there's a real kind of disconnect there, which actually, which isn't. I mean, if you know Russia, isn't a big deal, but it's always very hard for people in the West to understand. Is that even though most people say they're Orthodox in Russia, and they say that they're really into Orthodoxy and it's important to them, they never go to church and aren't religious. So, it's very much it's become a, like, having little ikonka has become a sort of a mark of belonging to a certain Putin majority. I don't think it reflects anything about morals or belief. So I don't think, despite like the absurd language about Satanism and how Russia is fighting Satanism, I don't think that's relevant to anyone. I don't think it has the same role that sort of the Ayatollahs used to play in Iran. So again, maybe they didn't believe in anything either. So it's much more about signifying belonging, signifying power. It remains a deeply amoral society with, very, very high rates of divorce, et cetera, et cetera. So, and it's interesting, whenever the church tries to push into the schools, they're usually pushed out again. So they need to know their place. Does it then maybe validate those still evil when you have the church saying sadism is okay, go and commit war crimes? Does it make it easier for people? Maybe. Does it play the role of the sort of, the invalidator of evil? Maybe. And will it change with the regime? I don't know, I guess so. What do we mean by change of the regime? We always use this word regime change.
Maybe another political system, another political leaders will not use so actively the church as the information or shaping minds tools.
It depends who it is. I just don't know.
Okay.
You mean the church is eternal, so I suppose they'll find some way.
You wrote that something is embedded into Russian system of life. Maybe the church is also embedded in system of life of Russia, and it's not so changeable.
Probably. I don't know. I don't have a clever answer. I'm struggling to think far beyond, the next 6 months. So I'm really struggling with this sort of big future. So I just don't know. I guess so. I don't know. When I lived in Russia, I don't think anybody took the church very seriously.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. And maybe the most difficult question, just a couple of sentences, how we Ukrainians could combat these Russian narratives. A couple of sentences. I understand this is very difficult task.
No. I think it is. I think the narratives differ from place to place, as you know. But I think what is constant is the type of communication that's used. So I think we live in a world where maybe ideology is less hard to define, but almost communication models can be an ideology. So Russia's communication model is deeply authoritarian. It believes that you can intimidate people, that people can be manipulated, that they're manipulatable, that people are weak, that you can sow doubt and confusion and people will look to authoritarian leadership. Its communication model is deeply linked to a lack of belief in the democratic subject, which is what we started with. I think what's been wonderful about Zelensky's communications and the communications from many Ukrainian civil society actors is that they fundamentally believe in people's democratic potential. They're looking for sympathy, empathy, dialogue, soучастие and cooperation, which means being a democratic subject. And that goes all the way from the models of communication that you use, the online town hall versus the troll farm. The troll farm is the symbol of authoritarian communication by definition. Doesn't matter what the message is, just the very model of communication undermines democratic potential. While an online town hall stimulates democratic debate. It depends on the idioms you use, the language. A conspiratorial language by definition destroys democratic potential. And it feeds on people's lack of self-confidence in being a democratic subject versus giving people evidence and then appealing to them to be your partner is an investment in their democratic potential. Through to the political messages, you know, Ukraine is fighting for democracy and Russia is fighting for the opposite. So I think that model, and as long as you have that in every case of what you do, it's almost the model, the language is the carrier of the meaning. And I think it doesn't matter where Ukraine then talks. You know, obviously the message will change whether you're talking to Brazil or Germany, Guinea-Bissau or Canada. And it should do. You've got to engage people on their interests. But we need to develop, and I think Ukraine and its allies need to do this, need to develop a sort of a democratic communications infrastructure that will compete with the Russian and Chinese and Iranian information warfare infrastructure. And I think we need to do it together. I think this should be like I've called it an informational Rammstein. I think we need to do that together because I think we have different strengths in different places. So I think that's very important. So it's the model, it's the type of communication rather than any one message, which I think can be consistent. And I think Ukraine is emerging as a leader in so many fields, but in the communications field especially. So it's a case of Ukraine can lead the West in this, I think.
Thank you so much, Peter. So we have some optimistic prognosis, and thanks for the answers. So difficult questions. We are all concerned about all these processes and about the finding the remedy against Russian information war and war itself. Thank you so much for your time, for joining us, for sharing your views, for your books. Please write more. We will translate more. Maybe you will write something in Ukrainian. We hope in the future.
I have I write in English, but I have amazing Ukrainian translators. I think Andy Bondar translated my first book. The brilliant Forestina did my second book. So my Ukrainian translators are amazing and probably improve the books.
Yes, thank you so much, and we hope that in some time we will have another conversation, and we'll analyze the case of Ukrainian counteract of Russian propaganda and maybe some lessons for other society, Ukrainian lessons. Thank you so much. Дорогі друзі, з нами був сьогодні Пітер Померанцев. Ми говорили про багато важливих для нас речей, про російську пропаганду, про демократію, про те, наскільки можлива нова демократична публічна сфера. Ми говорили про пам'ять і відповідальність. Ми говорили про те, як пов'язано з істиною, пов'язаний з поняттям істинний час. Ми говорили про певні тактичні речі, про те, наскільки ефективними є російські наративи, чому вони були обрані саме такі. Ми говорили про те, чому в Росії така підтримка серед населення цієї війни, звідки береться цей попит на цю риторику. Ми говорили і про те, чим можна цьому протистояти, і в першу чергу комунікаційна модель і мова, яку ми застосовуємо, яка протиставляється авторитаричній мові. Ми говорили про багато тих речей, над якими ми думаємо щодня. Дякуємо ще раз Пітеру, він вже втік на наступну свою зустріч. І дякуємо Збройним силам України за те, що дають змогу нам зустрічатися, говорити з цікавими людьми, знаходити рішення, ставити правильні запитання для того, щоб ці рішення далі знаходилися. Зичимо всім бути в безпеці, сил, натхнення і всім перемоги нам на тих фронтах, де ми з вами воюємо. Зустрінемося ще далі в нашому ефірі. Слідкуйте за нашими анонсами, як Аспен-спільнота, так і ширша громадськість. Ми готуємо вже зараз для вас цікаві події і корисні для України. Дякуємо всім і до побачення.